I want to tell you about a number, 60. That is the number of murders the Federal Bureau of Investigation has publicly connected to one man. 60 confirmed, not rumor, not legend, not the kind of inflated confession that collapses under scrutiny. 60 cases investigators were able to support through confession, case review, forensic evidence, travel history, victim details, and corroboration from local agencies. The actual number, the number investigators believe, may be accurate based on everything the man himself told them after his conviction, is higher. He confessed to 93 murders. Investigators considered those confessions credible, even though not every case could be fully closed with surviving evidence. 93 human beings. For context, Ted Bundy, perhaps the most famous serial killer in American history, the name that comes to mind first when most people think about serial killers, killed somewhere between 30 and 36 people. John Wayne Gacy killed 33. Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, who held the record for the most confirmed serial killer murders in American history for decades, killed 49. Samuel Little killed at least 60 people, and he confessed to 93. He is the most prolific serial killer in the documented history of the United States of America. And for most of his life, almost nobody knew his name. He was not famous. He was not the subject of best-selling books or HBO documentaries or obsessive investigative journalism. He was not the face on a composite sketch that a city organized its fear around. He was not BTK or the Golden State Killer or the Zodiac, the killers who became cultural landmarks, whose names became shorthand for a particular kind of dread. He was, for most of his criminal career, effectively invisible. Not because he was especially clever, not because he built elaborate operational systems to hide what he was. He was invisible for a reason that is far more disturbing than any operational genius. He was invisible because the women he chose to kill were women that the world had already decided not to see. He targeted women on the margins, women struggling with addiction, women involved in survival sex work, women who moved between cities, between shelters, between temporary arrangements that left them disconnected from the kind of stable network of relationships that produces a missing persons report, that produces a family calling the police, that produces the kind of sustained investigative attention that makes a case move. When these women disappeared, the world largely did not notice, and when their bodies were found, which often they were not, the cause of death was frequently misidentified. Sam Little did not use weapons, he used his hands. He was a large man with large hands, and he strangled his victims, and in jurisdictions across the country, across decades, that method of killing was routinely misclassified. Not homicide, drug overdose, heart failure, unknown causes. The bodies of women nobody was looking for, killed in a way that looked like something else, recorded in files that said nothing about murder. He traveled constantly. He drifted across the United States for decades, from California to Texas to Florida to Georgia to Ohio and beyond, moving the way people move when they have no permanent address and no permanent ties and no reason to stay anywhere long enough to be known. He was not building a system the way Israel Keyes built a system. He was simply moving, always moving, and as he moved, he killed. He was arrested numerous times across those years, for assault, for rape, for various offenses that put him briefly in contact with law enforcement in multiple states. Fingerprints, arrest files, and later DNA evidence existed in different places at different times, but for years they did not create the kind of national, real-time picture that would have exposed him. The pieces existed. The picture did not. He was first convicted of 3 murders in Los Angeles in 2014 and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He was 74 years old. Most people assumed that was the end of the story. A very old man, convicted of 3 murders, going to die in prison. Sad. Finished. Later, as his confessions were checked against additional cold cases, more convictions and legal acknowledgments would follow. But in 2014, the world still understood him as a 3-victim killer. That understanding was wrong. It was not finished. It was not even close to finished. Because in 2018, a Texas Ranger named James Holland drove to a California prison and sat down across from Samuel Little and did something that almost nobody had tried. He treated Sam Little not as a convicted killer to be processed and filed, but as a man with something to say. He asked him questions. He listened to the answers. He brought pencils and paper, and he asked Sam Little to draw. Sam Little drew portraits, detailed, skillful, hauntingly accurate portraits of women he had killed decades earlier. Women whose names he remembered. Women whose faces he carried in his memory with a precision that was simultaneously a tribute to what he had taken from them and the most disturbing evidence of who he was. And through those portraits, through the names and the locations and the dates and the details that Sam Little provided across hundreds of hours of interviews with James Holland, the true scale of what he had done began to emerge. 60 confirmed, possibly 93, across 19 states, spanning 5 decades, the most prolific serial killer in American history, and the world barely knew his name. This is the story of Samuel Little, and of the women he killed, and of the system that made him possible, and of the Texas Ranger who finally decided that what had been invisible for 50 years deserved to be seen. Samuel Little was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia. He was born into poverty, and into the particular vulnerability that comes from poverty compounded by race in the American South of the 1940s. His mother was young and unable to care for him, and he was raised by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio, a small industrial city on the shore of Lake Erie. His grandmother was, by the accounts of those who knew the family, a stabilizing and loving presence. But Samuel Little grew up with the particular wound of a child who knows, at some level, that the parent who should have been there was not. That wound does not always produce a killer. Most people who carry it do not become killers. But it becomes part of the story, the way that all early childhood experiences become part of the story, present in the background even when we cannot fully see it. He was a large boy and grew into a large man, over 6 feet tall, powerfully built, with hands that were, by the testimony of every person who encountered him in the context of his crimes, extraordinarily strong. He had been a boxer in his youth, an amateur with genuine talent, and the physicality that boxing develops, the particular combination of strength and precision in the hands, never left him. He began accumulating arrests as a young man, shoplifting, breaking, and entering fraud. The offenses escalated as he moved into adulthood. By the 1970s, he had been arrested in multiple states for assault and for rape. He was convicted. He served time. He was released. He moved to another state. He was arrested again. This pattern, the serial arrest and release and relocation pattern of a man who was known to local law enforcement everywhere he went, but unknown to any larger coordinating system, was itself a product of the era. In the 1970s and 1980s, the information-sharing systems that did exist were limited, unevenly used, and nothing like the integrated databases investigators rely on today. An officer in one state might process Samuel Little for a violent offense without seeing the full pattern of arrests, assaults, and suspicious deaths that followed him across the country. No single system consistently flagged the pattern, saw the accumulation across state lines, and recognized it as something larger and more dangerous than a man with a local criminal history. He moved constantly. California, Texas, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, Nevada. He drifted across the country, working temporary jobs, living on the margins, and killing women in the cities and towns he passed through. He did not confine his crimes to the margin of the road or the dark edge of a park. He was not afraid to operate in urban environments. He picked up women, drove them to isolated locations, killed them, and left them. Then he moved on. He did not stay long enough anywhere to become associated with a pattern. He did not kill in clusters that investigators could map onto a single location. He spread his crimes across geography and time in a way that made them, to any individual jurisdiction, look like isolated incidents rather than parts of a connected series. He was the most prolific serial killer in American history. He was also, for most of that history, someone that no single investigator had enough of the picture to see. To understand how Samuel Little killed at least 60 women, Without triggering a national investigation, you have to understand something about how American law enforcement categorized death in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. And you have to understand something about which women the system was built to notice and which women it was built. By neglect and by bias and by 1,000 small institutional failures to overlook. Sam Little targeted women who were, in the language of law enforcement at the time, considered high risk. That term, high risk, is a categorization that sounds clinical and neutral and is neither. What it means in practice is women who are involved in survival sex work, women with active addiction, women who are homeless or transient, women who exist in spaces that formal society does not regularly observe and does not regularly protect. These are women with names, women with histories, women with people who loved them, who had watched them struggle, who had hoped they would come back, who had sometimes stopped hoping and then felt guilty for stopping. They are not abstractions. They are not statistics. They are Melissa Thomas and Carol Elford and Denise Brothers, and Melinda Lepre and Rosie Hill and dozens of others, each one a specific person with a specific life. But in the jurisdictions where their bodies were found, or in the jurisdictions where they simply disappeared without their bodies ever being found, the response was often inadequate. Sometimes their disappearances were not reported at all. Sometimes they were reported and treated as low priority because of their circumstances. Sometimes their bodies were found and the cause of death was not correctly identified. This last point is critical. Sam Little killed by strangulation. He used his hands. He was large and strong, and he knew, from boxing and from the accumulated dark knowledge of a man who had been doing this for decades, exactly how to apply the pressure that would kill without leaving the kind of obvious marks that a weapon produces. In county after county, state after state, medical examiners and coroners looked at the bodies of women found in fields and alleys and roadsides and ruled causes of death that were not murder. Drug overdose was the most common misclassification. The women were found in environments consistent with drug use. They had histories of drug use. The assumption was the assumption that confirmation bias produces. The evidence fit the story that was already expected, so the story was accepted. Heart failure, undetermined causes, accidental death. The files were closed. The women were buried or cremated. The cases were not investigated as homicides, and Sam Little moved on to the next city. He was not invisible because he was clever. He was invisible because the system had already decided that the women he killed did not warrant the kind of attention that would have made him visible. That is the institutional truth at the heart of the Sam Little story. And it is the truth that makes the story about much more than one man. In 2012, Sam Little was living in a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky. He was 72 years old. He had been killing, by his own account, since the 1970s. He had been arrested and released so many times, across so many jurisdictions, that the pattern had never cohered into something a single investigator could see. The Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VICAP, is a national database maintained by the FBI designed to help law enforcement agencies identify connections between violent crimes across jurisdictions. It had been established in 1985, partly in response to the growing recognition that serial killers operating across state lines were effectively invisible to individual local agencies working their cases in isolation. VICAP was the right idea, but like every database, it depended on participation, completeness, and human attention. Agencies did not always enter every relevant case. Older files were sometimes incomplete. The system required human beings to connect the dots, and human beings working overwhelmed caseloads in underfunded departments did not always have the time to input every case, cross-reference every name, and chase every possible pattern. In 2012, investigators in Los Angeles were working 3 cold case murders from the late 1980s. The victims were women found strangled in the Los Angeles area. The cases had sat unsolved for over 2 decades. DNA evidence had been collected at the original crime scenes and preserved. As DNA databases expanded in the early 2000s, The profiles from those cases were entered into the national database. In 2012, a hit came back. The DNA matched Samuel Little, who had been arrested in Kentucky and brought back into the system at exactly the moment when cold case DNA comparisons had become powerful enough to reach across decades. A man who had killed for decades across the United States was connected to 3 Los Angeles murders by a DNA match generated from a drug arrest in Kentucky. He was extradited to California. He was tried. In 2014, at the age of 74, Samuel Little was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. And then, by the logic of a system that processes cases rather than patterns, that was supposed to be the end. 3 murders, solved. Man in prison for life. Case closed. The case was not closed. Not remotely. James Holland is a Texas Ranger. That title, a specific weight in American law enforcement history, a weight built over nearly 2 centuries of a force that has operated at the edge of the frontier and the edge of the law, that has been mythologized and criticized and reformed and mythologized again, that represents something specific about a certain kind of relentless, independent, determined investigative work. James Holland is not mythological. He is a working investigator who believed, based on information from the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program analysts who had been quietly building a case behind the scenes, that the 3 Los Angeles murders Samuel Little had been convicted of were not the full story, that there were connections between Little and cold cases across the country, that the man sitting in a California prison cell was not a killer who had committed 3 murders. He was a killer who had committed dozens. The VICAP analysts, particularly an analyst named Angela Williamson, who had been studying Little's pattern for years, had built a picture from the database that was deeply alarming. Cases across multiple states, victims who matched Little's described type, dates and locations that aligned with his known movements. The picture was not complete, because so many of his crimes had been misclassified or never entered into the database at all. But the outline of it was visible to anyone who looked at the full data rather than at any individual case in isolation. Holland looked. He saw the outline, and he drove to California. In 2018, Texas Ranger James Holland went to meet Samuel Little, then serving life sentences in California. He was 77 years old by then. He had been convicted and sentenced. He had no apparent reason to cooperate with a Texas Ranger asking questions about cold cases in states he had not been charged in. He had, from a purely strategic standpoint, nothing to gain from talking. Holland understood this. He had thought carefully about what approach would work with a man like Samuel Little. Not confrontation, not pressure, not the standard interview dynamic of suspect and interrogator, of truth extraction as a one-sided process. Something different. He came in with respect, not approval of what Little had done, not a performance of empathy designed to manipulate, but genuine recognition that the man across the table was intelligent, was complex, and had something to say that the world had not yet heard. He came in with patience. He came in willing to talk about boxing, which Little had loved, willing to listen to stories, willing to let the conversation breathe before it narrowed toward the thing he needed to know. And he brought paper and pencils, because he had learned in preparation for the interviews that Samuel Little could draw, not as an amateur, as someone with genuine visual memory and genuine artistic skill. He remembered faces. He had always remembered faces. The faces of the women he had killed were stored in his memory with a fidelity that was, in the context of everything else about him, almost incomprehensible. Holland asked Little to draw them. It was the right ask. It was the ask that opened the door. Samuel Little drew for hours. He drew in pencil and in colored pencil. He drew faces, female faces, detailed and specific, each one representing a woman whose name he sometimes remembered and sometimes did not, whose city he sometimes remembered and sometimes could only approximate, whose decade he sometimes remembered and sometimes could only guess. The portraits were extraordinary. Not in the way that extraordinary sometimes means spectacular or beautiful, but in the way that extraordinary means far outside what was expected. Here was a man who had killed these women, who had held their lives in his hands and ended them, who carried their faces in his memory with the same precision a photographer carries an image. He drew them from the inside out, from the specific remembered curve of a jaw, the particular expression of an eye, the way a certain woman had worn her hair on a certain night in a certain city decades earlier. He drew and he talked. He told James Holland about each woman as he drew her, where he had met her, what city, what approximate year, what she had been like, what she had said to him before he killed her. He talked about them the way a person talks about people they remember, with specific detail, with the involuntary warmth of recollection, which was perhaps the most deeply disturbing quality of the entire interview series. He remembered them. He had always remembered them. He had killed them and then carried their faces for decades. The portraits, combined with the location and time information Little provided, gave investigators something they had never had before: a detailed, self-generated map of his crimes. Not complete. He could not remember every detail about every victim. He could not always give names. But each portrait, each description, each approximation of location and time was a thread that investigators could pull. Holland and the team working around him, which included VICAP analysts, local investigators from multiple states, and FBI agents who had been quietly building the broader picture, began running the portraits and descriptions against unsolved cases across the country. They cross-referenced the faces with missing persons reports. They compared the dates and locations with cases that had been classified as something other than homicide. They contacted medical examiners' offices in multiple states to request that cold cases be reconsidered in light of new information. Case after case opened. Cold files were pulled from storage. Bodies that had been classified as overdoses were reclassified as homicides. Women who had been counted as missing were now counted as murdered. Names that had existed only in the memory of the people who loved these women, names that had never appeared in any investigative file because no investigation had ever been opened, began to appear. Dozens of cases began to move. By 2019, the FBI was publicly describing Samuel Little as the most prolific serial killer in United States history, based on the number of confirmed victims attributed to him. The portraits had done it. The pencils had done it. James Holland, sitting across from an old man in a prison cell and asking the question nobody had thought to ask before. Stop. Before we go further into the investigation, into the numbers and the jurisdictions and the extraordinary process, by which the full scope of what Samuel Little had done was assembled from fragments across 5 decades, I need you to stop and think about the women, because the numbers are astonishing, and the method is extraordinary, and the investigation is genuinely remarkable. But the numbers are people. Every number is a person, and these particular people had already been overlooked once. They had already been undercounted, misclassified, filed under causes of death that erased what had actually happened to them. They deserved to be seen. They deserved to be named. Melissa Thomas was from Opelousas, Louisiana. She was 28 years old when Sam Little killed her in 1996. Her family had not known what happened to her for more than 20 years. Little drew her portrait. Investigators matched the portrait to a Jane Doe case. The Jane Doe was identified as Melissa Thomas. Her family received the answer they had been waiting for. Carol Elford was 34 years old. She was from the Miami area and was killed in 1982. For decades, she existed in case files as a woman whose cause of death was uncertain. The reclassification of her case as a homicide, made possible by Little's cooperation, gave her death a true accounting. Denise Brothers was from Odessa, Texas. She disappeared in 1994. Little remembered her. He drew her. He described the location where her body had been left. That information led investigators to reclassify her case and finally give her family the answer they had lived without for nearly 30 years. Melinda Lapre was 23 years old and from Pascagoula, Mississippi. Her remains were found in 1982. She was identified as a Jane Doe. For decades, she had a case number and no name. Little's cooperation returned her name to her. Rosie Hill was from Cleveland, Ohio. She was killed in 1984. She had a son. Her son grew up not knowing with certainty what had happened to his mother. The confirmation that came through the little investigation gave him something he had not had: a specific answer. The portrait sessions produced faces and names and locations across 19 states. Some of the women were identified. Their families were found and notified. Some remain unidentified. Their portraits circulated by the FBI on a dedicated website. Their faces drawn by the man who killed them, now serving as the instrument of their recognition. The FBI has made those portraits public, has asked for the public's help in identifying the remaining unknown victims, and continues to receive leads. Some will never be identified. Their portraits exist. Their faces exist in the memory of the man who ended their lives, and now in the public record where they had never existed before. That is not justice. It is not closure. It is something smaller and more painful. Recognition, finally, that they were here. They were always here. The world just refused to look. Samuel Little operated for 50 years. He killed across 19 states. He was arrested dozens of times. His name, fingerprints, case files, and in later years DNA evidence existed in multiple law enforcement systems and jurisdictions. He was known, in the local sense, to police in cities across the country. And for 50 years, nobody connected the dots. This failure was not the failure of any single investigator or any single department. It was a systemic failure, compounded across decades and across jurisdictions, built from the accumulated weight of underfunding and inadequate information sharing and bias and the particular institutional blindness that comes from viewing some victims as more deserving of investigative resources than others. The information sharing problem was real and technical and has been partially addressed in the decades since Little's career. The National DNA Database has been expanded significantly. VICAP has been improved. The systems that would allow a Kentucky drug arrest to trigger a connection to a Los Angeles cold case in a matter of months, rather than decades, are better than they were in 1980 or even in 2000. But the technical problems were built on top of something more fundamental. The women Sam Little killed were not invisible because the technology to find their killer did not exist. They were invisible because the system had made a prior decision, implicit and pervasive and rarely examined directly, about which victims deserved the full weight of investigative attention and which did not. Survival sex workers, women with addiction, women who were unhoused, transient, disconnected from the stable networks that produce persistent missing persons investigations. These women were, in the formal and informal priorities of law enforcement across multiple decades, lower priority. Their disappearances generated less alarm. Their deaths generated less attention. Their cases generated less follow-up. Sam Little knew this. He has said, in interviews, that he knew these were women who would not be missed. Not that they were not loved. Not that they did not have families who cared. He knew they were women that the system had already decided not to prioritize. He selected them, in part, because of that institutional indifference. He used the system's bias as a weapon against the women it had failed to protect. That is the most uncomfortable truth in the entire Sam Little story. More uncomfortable than the numbers. More uncomfortable than the method. He did not create the vulnerability he exploited. He found it already there, built into the institutions that were supposed to protect everyone. The reforms that have followed, the expanded databases, the renewed attention to cold cases involving marginalized victims. The specific FBI initiative that resulted from the Little investigation represent genuine institutional change. They are insufficient, but they represent a recognition, forced by the scale of what Little did, that the prior approach had a fatal flaw. That recognition cost 60 lives, at minimum, possibly 93. The cost of institutional indifference is always paid by the people the institution was supposed to serve. Here is a specific and technical detail that deserves its own moment of attention, because it is at the heart of how Samuel Little remained invisible for so long. When a person dies and the cause of death is not immediately obvious, a medical examiner or coroner is responsible for determining that cause. In the cases of the women Sam Little killed, the challenge was that strangulation, his method, can be difficult to definitively identify in certain circumstances, particularly when the body has been exposed to the elements for a period of time, when decomposition has begun, when the petechial hemorrhaging and ligature marks and hyoid bone fractures that indicate strangulation have been obscured by time or by the conditions of discovery. In those circumstances, the cause of death determination defaults to the available evidence and the prevailing assumption. And in case after case, in jurisdiction after jurisdiction, across decades, the prevailing assumption about the death of a marginalized woman found in a field or an alley was not murder. It was overdose. It was natural causes. It was undetermined. The assumption fit the circumstances. The assumption closed the file. This was not, in every case, negligence. Some of these determinations were made by overworked professionals with limited resources doing the best they could with incomplete information in underfunded offices. Some of them were made in error, genuinely, without any intent to minimize the death. Some of them were made with a bias, conscious or not, that shaped what the evidence was allowed to suggest. The result, in every case, was the same. A death that should have been a homicide was not a homicide. A case that should have generated an investigation did not generate one. A killer who should have been a suspect was not a suspect. And Sam Little moved on. After the Little investigation produced its full scope, forensic pathologists and medical examiners across multiple states went back to those old files. They went back with new eyes and new information and new questions. They found, in case after case, that the evidence of strangulation had been there. Subtle, easy to miss without the specific knowledge that they were looking for it, but present. The petechial hemorrhaging, the fractured cartilage, the markers that a trained eye, looking for them, could identify. The markers had been there. The questions had not been asked. The reclassifications that resulted from this re-examination changed the official record of dozens of deaths. Women who had died as overdoses in the official ledger of American mortality were reclassified as homicide victims. The ledger changed. The women did not come back, but the record of what happened to them became finally accurate. Accuracy came 50 years too late, but it came, and that matters even if it cannot be enough. The story of how Sam Little was finally fully exposed is not only the story of James Holland and the portrait sessions. It is also the story of a woman working quietly in the background of law enforcement for years, building a case from data that no single agency had prioritized. Angela Williamson was an analyst with the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. VICAP, as it is known, is a national clearinghouse for information about violent crimes, designed to allow investigators across jurisdictions to identify connections between cases that might otherwise remain invisible to individual local agencies. The program is only as good as the data entered into it, and the data entered into it is only as good as the attention agencies bring to the process of entering it. For decades, VICAP was underutilized. Agencies did not consistently enter their cases. The database was incomplete in ways that limited its usefulness. The analysts working with it were doing their best with partial information. Angela Williamson was one of those analysts, and she had been looking at a pattern that, in the partial data available to her, suggested something alarming. There were multiple cases, spread across multiple states, spanning multiple decades, that shared characteristics. Marginalized female victims, strangulation, no identified suspect, geographic spread consistent with a traveling offender. She had been building a file on Sam Little for years before James Holland ever drove to California. She had been connecting cases that no single jurisdiction had thought to connect. She had been, in the patient, unglamorous, absolutely essential way of the best analytical work, seeing the shape of something that was invisible from any single vantage point, but visible from hers. When Little was convicted in 2014, it was Williamson who pushed the broader question. Were there more? Were the 3 Los Angeles murders the beginning of the count, or the end of it? She had the data suggesting the answer. She did not yet have the confirmation. She brought her analysis to the investigators who could act on it. She connected Holland to the picture she had built, the portrait sessions, the extraordinary cooperation that followed, the 60 confirmed murders, and the broader estimate of 93. All of it flows from the work that Angela Williamson had been doing quietly, methodically, in a database that nobody was watching closely enough. The unglamorous work. The work that does not get the book deal or the documentary. The work of an analyst, sitting with a database and refusing to look away from the pattern that nobody else has noticed yet. That work saved no one who had already died, but it has given answers to families who had been waiting for them. It has changed the official record of what happened to 60 women, and it has forced a national conversation about which victims the system chooses to see. Angela Williamson deserves to be part of this story. She is. The interview sessions between James Holland and Samuel Little extended over months. They took place in a California prison. Little was in his late 70s, in declining health, confined to a wheelchair by the end of the process. He was, physically, an old man. The threat he had represented was long contained. What remained was the information he carried. He was cooperative in a way that investigators found both valuable and necessary to understand carefully. His cooperation was not born of remorse. He did not, in the course of hundreds of hours of conversation, express remorse in any way that investigators found credible. He talked about the women he had killed with the equanimity of someone recounting episodes from a long and eventful life. They were part of his history. He carried them without apparent distress. His cooperation was born of something else. Pride, partly. The pride of a man who had done something, by his own assessment, extraordinary, and who had never received credit for the full scope of it. He had been convicted of 3 murders. 3. And he had committed 60, possibly more. The gap between the 3 and the 60 was a gap that he apparently needed, on some level, to close. Not for justice, for recognition. He also seemed to genuinely enjoy the sessions themselves. The attention, the structured conversation, the drawing. James Holland had correctly identified something about Samuel Little that made the portrait approach the right one. He was a visual thinker. The faces were more accessible to him than the abstract details. When he sat down to draw, the memories came with the drawing, the names and the cities and the approximate years. Information that he could not have organized into a coherent verbal account, but that emerged naturally as his hand moved. Holland listened across all those hours. He let Little lead. He asked questions that opened doors rather than closing them, that invited more detail rather than demanding specific answers. He built a relationship, not a friendship, not an endorsement, but a working relationship in which Little understood that Holland would listen seriously to everything he said and would take it where it needed to go. The information Holland gathered across those sessions was extraordinary in its volume and its specificity. Little provided details of crimes across 19 states. He remembered with varying levels of clarity the circumstances of each killing. He was clearer on some than others. He was vaguer about the earliest crimes, the ones from the 1970s, than about the more recent ones. But across the sweep of the information he provided, a picture assembled itself that investigators could verify, cross-reference, and act upon. Not every detail checked out. Some of Little's information was inaccurate, whether from genuine or from embellishment, or from deliberate misdirection. Investigators were not always certain. The process of verification was itself a years-long project, requiring cooperation from law enforcement agencies and medical examiners and records departments across the country. But enough checked out. Enough checked out to confirm 60 murders. Enough checked out to identify women whose deaths had been filed under wrong causes. Enough checked out to return names to women who had existed only, as Jane does, in databases for decades. Enough checked out to change everything. Not every victim came back to Sam Little with the same clarity. There were women he drew, whose faces he remembered, but whose names he had never known. Women he had encountered only briefly, whose lives he had extinguished, and whose personal details had never registered. Women who remain, even now, portraits without names, faces without identities. The FBI has published those portraits. They are available on the FBI's website as part of the ongoing Samuel Little investigation. The Bureau has appealed to the public for help in identifying the women in those portraits. and that appeal has produced results. Some of the unidentified women have been given names through public tips, through the recognition of family members who saw a portrait that looked like someone who had gone missing decades earlier. Some remain unidentified. Their portraits exist. Their faces are public. The man who killed them drew them from memory. And the drawings are real and specific and recognizable in the way that portraits drawn by someone who genuinely saw the person are real and specific and recognizable. There is something deeply strange and deeply painful about that reality. The only record that exists of some of these women, the only specific personal visual record, the only document that captures who they looked like as individuals rather than as case numbers, was made by the man who killed them. He is the last person who saw them. He drew what he saw. And those drawings, those portraits made by a killer from memory, are now the best hope that some of these women have of being identified and returned, in some small way, to the families who have been waiting. There is no comfortable way to hold that truth. There is only the truth itself, and the obligation to do something with it. The FBI is still working. The public is still helping. New identifications are still being made. The process is slow and partial and will never be complete. But it is continuing. And that continuation is, in its inadequate way, something. When the FBI began working through the Sam Little case and reached out to families of potential victims, they encountered people who had been waiting a very long time. People who had reported loved ones missing and received minimal investigative attention. People who had lived for decades in the particular uncertainty of not knowing, which is its own form of suffering, different from grief but related to it, sitting alongside it and complicating it in ways that are difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. Not knowing whether your person is alive or dead, carrying the small, irrational hope that maybe, somehow, against every reasonable probability, they are alive somewhere, just unable to contact you. Holding that hope while also knowing, at some deeper level, that the hope is likely false. Living in the gap between what you know and what you fear, unable to fully grieve because grief requires certainty, unable to stop grieving because the absence is total. The families of Sam Little's victims had lived in that gap for years, some of them for decades, some of them for nearly 50 years. When investigators contacted them with information from the Little case, the response was, by the accounts of the investigators who made those calls and visited those families, overwhelming. Not uniformly. Every family processed the information differently, in the way that every family processes everything differently. Some families felt relief. The not knowing was over. The terrible uncertainty was replaced by a terrible certainty. But certainty at least closes a door that uncertainty holds open. Some families felt anger. Anger that this had taken so long. Anger that the investigation that should have happened decades earlier had not happened. Anger that their person had been misclassified, had been counted wrong, had been buried or cremated under a cause of death that erased what had actually been done to them. The anger was legitimate. It was earned. It was the appropriate response to a system that had failed the people they loved. Some families felt grief so acute and so fresh that it was difficult to witness. People who had constructed, over decades, an emotional architecture around the not knowing, who had built a way of living that accommodated the uncertainty, suddenly had the ground shifted beneath them. The confirmed death, the specific killer, the specific circumstances, hit them with the force of something that had happened yesterday rather than something that had happened 30 or 40 years ago. Because in some ways it had happened yesterday. The news of it had happened yesterday. The closure, if that is the right word for something so inadequate, was new. The grief that arrived with it was new. The weight of the confirmed answer fell on people who had been carrying the weight of the unconfirmed question for decades, and the exchange, while necessary, was not light. Every family deserved to know sooner. Every family deserved an investigation that took their person seriously from the beginning. The answers came late. They came because a Texas Ranger drove to a California prison with paper and pencils. They should have come long before that. That they did not is the failure that no amount of eventual justice can fully repair. Some of Sam Little's victims had children. Children who had grown up with a missing mother, with the question of where she had gone and why she had not come back, with the particular wound that a missing parent leaves in a child. Those children are adults now. Some of them are in their 40s and 50s. They grew up, built their own lives, had their own children, and carried the absence of their mother through every milestone, every ordinary Tuesday, every moment when a parent should have been present and was not. For some of those adult children, the identification of their mother as a victim of Samuel Little was the first real information they had received about what had happened. They had grown up knowing their mother was gone. They had not known why. They had not known who. They had not known, in some cases, whether she was dead or alive, whether she had chosen to leave or been taken. The confirmation was, simultaneously, devastating and necessary. Devastating because it closed the small, irrational door of hope that a person always keeps slightly ajar when they do not have a definitive answer. Necessary because you cannot fully heal from a wound you cannot fully see. Some of those adult children have spoken publicly about their experience. Some have participated in the FBI's identification efforts, providing DNA samples for comparison against unidentified remains, helping to confirm identifications, helping to put names back onto the women their mothers had been before they became case files. Some of them have spoken about their mothers, specifically, by name, in interviews and in statements and in testimony. They have described who their mothers were before the addiction, before the circumstances that made them visible to Sam Little. They have described the mothers they remember, the mothers who existed before the worst chapters of their lives, the mothers who had been people with full lives and specific personalities and genuine loves. Those descriptions matter. They push back against the reduction of these women to their most difficult years, to the circumstances that made them vulnerable, to the categories that the system used to justify its inattention. The women Sam Little killed were people before they were victims. They were daughters and sisters and mothers and friends. They had histories that preceded the circumstances of their deaths. They had names, they had faces, they had people who loved them. Sam Little drew their faces. The world needs to remember the rest. In response to the Samuel Little investigation, the FBI launched a specific initiative in 2019 focused on unidentified victims in Little's case. The initiative included the publication of the portraits Little had drawn, the creation of a dedicated public-facing website, and an active appeal to the public and law enforcement agencies across the country to come forward with information about potential victims. The response has been significant. Tips have come in from across the country. Some of those tips have led to identifications. Women who had been buried as Jane Does have been identified. Families have been notified. Cases have been officially reclassified from undetermined or accidental death to homicide. The initiative also produced something broader. A renewed national conversation about the category of victims that law enforcement had historically underserved, about the way that the circumstances of a victim's life had been allowed to determine the intensity of the investigative response to their death, about the fundamental principle that every homicide victim deserves the same quality of investigation regardless of who they were. That conversation is ongoing. It is uncomfortable. It implicates not just individual officers or individual departments, but a systemic set of priorities that were built over decades and that cannot be dismantled quickly. But the conversation is happening. The Little case forced it into the open in a way that was difficult to ignore. Because the scale of what had been missed, 60 to 93 murders across 19 states and 5 decades, was too large to explain away as isolated failure. The changes pushed by this case include renewed calls for stronger VICAP participation, better cross-jurisdictional data sharing, more careful cold case review, closer attention to strangulation indicators, and greater investigative urgency when the victim is marginalized. None of these reforms are sufficient on their own. Together, they represent a meaningful shift in the direction of an institutional attention that was long overdue. 60 lives at minimum are the price of the lesson. The least we can do is learn it. Samuel Little died on December 30th, 2020. He was 80 years old. He died in a California hospital while serving life sentences. He had been in declining health for years. He died with the work unfinished. Some of his victims remain unidentified. Some of the cases he described to James Holland remain open in the sense that they have not been definitively closed by the discovery of remains or the confirmation of identities. The full picture that Little carried in his memory was never fully transferred to the investigators who needed it, partly because he controlled what he shared, and partly because memory itself is fallible, particularly the memory of a very old man recounting crimes committed over 5 decades. He died having been identified, publicly and officially, as the most prolific serial killer in United States history. He died with 60 confirmed murders attached to his name. He died with 93 as the FBI's broader estimate. He died with his portraits on the FBI's website, with his face known to the country in a way it had never been during the decades when he was killing. He died having given, through the portrait sessions with James Holland, more information about his crimes than investigators had any right to expect from a man with no legal obligation to cooperate. Whether that cooperation was driven by pride or by something approaching conscience, or by the simple desire for the extended attention that the interviews provided, investigators were never fully certain. Probably all three, in proportions that shifted from session to session. He died having never expressed, in any way, that those who knew the case well considered credible, genuine remorse. The women he drew, the women whose faces he carried, were not a source of guilt for him. They were a source of something more complicated and more disturbing, a kind of possession. He had taken them. He remembered them. He was the only living person who knew all of their stories. That knowledge died with him. Some of it, not all of it. Enough was transferred through the portraits and the interviews and the investigations that followed to give 60 families answers. The rest went with him. He took it deliberately. One final act of control from a man who had spent his life controlling what other people could see and what they could not. James Holland has spoken publicly about the Samuel Little case in the years since Little's death. He has given interviews. He has described the interview process, the approach he took, the way the portrait sessions developed. He has been, in those conversations, consistently careful to redirect attention from himself to the women. He has said, in various ways across various interviews, that the point of the work was never Samuel Little. Samuel Little was the means to an end. The end was the women. The end was the families. The end was the cold cases that had been sitting in files without resolution because no one had ever had enough of the picture to see the full shape of what had happened. The Texas Ranger who drove to a California prison with paper and pencils did not do something that looks, in the description, particularly dramatic. He sat down with an old man and listened. He asked the right questions. He created conditions in which a man who had never been fully honest with anyone was willing to be honest, not entirely, and not without calculation, but more honestly than he had ever been before. That listening, that patient and strategic and deeply skilled listening, is what produced the 60 confirmed murders, what produced the reclassified cases, what produced the portraits and the identifications and the notifications to families who had been waiting decades for someone to call. It is not a glamorous skill. It does not make for the kind of story that writes itself into mythology. But it is a skill as important as any in law enforcement. The ability to sit with a person who has done monstrous things and to listen to them not because they deserve to be heard, but because the people they harmed deserve the truth. The ability to set aside everything the work costs you personally and keep going. Keep listening. Keep asking the right question. James Holland kept asking. The answers changed what is officially known about 60 human lives, about 60 families, about the most undercounted chapter in the history of American violent crime. That is the work. Sometimes the work looks like a detective with a shovel and a warrant. Sometimes it looks like a Texas Ranger and a box of colored pencils. Both matter. The pencils, in this case, mattered more. The FBI's public count is at least 60 confirmed murders. Samuel Little confessed to 93. The space between those two numbers is where the remaining questions live. Every number in that range is a person. Every person has a name. Every name has a history that extends far beyond the circumstances of their death, far beyond the addiction, or the poverty, or the survival strategies that made them visible to Samuel Little and invisible to the systems that should have protected them. Melissa Thomas had a family in Louisiana who loved her. Carol Elford had people in Florida who did not stop wondering what had happened to her. Denise Brothers had a family in Texas who waited nearly 30 years for an answer. Melinda Laprie was 23 years old. Rosie Hill had a son. And there are 45 confirmed others, and possibly 30 more beyond that, each one a specific person with a specific life that was taken by a specific man in a specific moment. Each one deserving of the same recognition, the same investigative attention, the same determination to find the truth that any other murder victim would have received had their circumstances been different. The system did not give them that. The system, built by human beings with human biases and human priorities, decided implicitly and repeatedly that the circumstances of these women's lives made their deaths less urgent. That decision allowed Samuel Little to operate for 50 years. That decision is the institutional truth that the Little case forced into the open and that this country is still working to fully reckon with. James Holland drove to a California prison and asked a man to draw. Angela Williamson sat with a database and refused to stop seeing the pattern. The FBI published portraits and asked the public to look. Families who had been waiting for decades received phone calls. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough to repair 50 years of institutional failure, to give back the decades of investigation that were not conducted, to compensate the families who grew up without answers and the women who died without justice. But it was something. It was the beginning of the accounting, and the accounting continues. Samuel Little is dead. His portraits are public. His confirmed victim count stands at least 60, and his confessed total is 93. Investigators and local agencies continue to work through the remaining open questions. Public tips and renewed case review have helped identify some victims. Families have been notified. Cases have been reclassified. The work that should have begun in the 1970s is being completed in the 2020s, which is far too late, and also the best that can be done now. The women he killed deserved better from a country that should have seen them. They deserved investigations that took them seriously from the first day they went missing. They deserved medical examiners who asked every question. They deserved the full weight of the system that was supposed to serve them. They did not get that while they were alive. The least this story can do is give them their names. 60 names, 60 lives. Not one of them a number. If this story reached you, share it. The FBI made Samuel Little victim identification materials public. Some of the women in those portraits are still waiting to be named. They were always worth looking for.